So grab your pencil and paper. We're going to do our warm up. Just to give us a little boundary between all that noise and news and everything going on, and also all the thoughts in our mind. We're going to buffer that to a little quiet time, just a short quiet time here. I'll keep track of the time for you. So yeah, just grab your pencil, sit in your chair there, notice your position. Give a little attention to your body so that you're comfortable. So your back feels good and your shoulders. You can feel the weight on the chair. Your knees are comfortable. Your feet are resting in a nice balanced way. Yeah, and you're starting to feel a little bit excited to get some drawing done. So you can pick up the pencil and move it toward the paper, noticing how you're holding the pencil, how it is in your hand. Maybe try a different grip. Try something new, different avenue of the brain to exercise. Maybe try the different hand this time. If you haven't done that or not comfortable with that, that's always good. These are just marks we're making on the paper, just freely making marks. So yeah, if you try something and your inner critic tells you it doesn't work, that's okay, because yeah, it's just warming up. So just making marks and really paying attention to the motion of the hand and can you feel the muscles maybe in your arm, your bicep, your shoulder, your back that you're moving. Yeah, noticing the muscles that you're moving, how tightly you're gripping the pencil, how much pressure you're putting on the page, how long each mark is. Lots to pay attention to, lots to notice. Not if it's good or bad, that doesn't make sense in this case. Just marking for the sake of marking, for the sake of noticing the movement, and for the sake of noticing your breath and the timing of the motion. Just trying to really enliven your senses to that process of drawing, completely apart from some subject matter, completely apart from any convention that might have gotten in your mind about drawing. Just letting the pencil move. And hopefully it's fun. It should be fun. Remember those fun times that it's been really free just to scribble. You can scribble. I won't tell anyone. No one will see it. You can hide it later. It's okay. If it's fun, just go on and scribble. Go fast, go slow. Taking a deep breath. Listening to the sound maybe of the pencil on the paper. Feeling the roughness or the smoothness of the paper. Jesus, so many things to tune into. Is the point of the pencil sharp? Are you making thin lines? Are you using the edge of the point to make flat, wide lines? Are they light? Are they dark? Are you making a regular pattern or letting things go all over? Do your marks cross over one another? Are they all separate? All things to notice. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and pick up the pencil and move it to a new spot. And we're going to make a line on the page. It can be curly, it can be straight, it can be winding, it can be anything, but just kind of go in a segment, point A to point B. Then we're going to start at one end of the line, and we're going to pick a side of that, and we're going to kind of shade one of those sides, kind of pulling lines. I think you can see that. There's my curvy line, and I've got some lines on one side of it. You can do that for a while, and if you feel like it changed to the other side, change back if you like. Work your way down the line. You can shade all one side, or you can shade alternating. That's kind of how I'm doing it. Just very quickly. Not agonizing over it. It's not something we're making that's beautiful. Just we're taking that line and we're expanding it, expanding the boundary. We're making it more of a shape than a line, but being conscious of either side of it. Using that to direct where we draw. Yeah, if you're working real quick, you can make another one real quick. Maybe the line curves back on itself a little bit. So here I made another one next to it. I put some shading in there. And I'm also beginning to pay attention to the distance between the two things that are growing. So there's a shape growing in there and there's shading. And if you got that one, let's do one where we make it more enclosed. So it's not a completely closed shape, but maybe 3/4 of a circle or yeah, this is what I got. It's kind of like part of a circle. Yeah, and then again, paying attention to the boundary, to the line as a boundary. Shading maybe on the inside or on the outside or letting it cross over. It's another quick one. I'll show you. Yeah, working quickly. These are quick exercises, warm-ups. Yeah, I'll show you. That's mine. That's kind of a part circle with some shading on it. That one's fun, I think. I'll show you some good examples after a while, but yeah, it's fun to see what the possibilities are for yourself. Even in an odd shape, thinking about shading on one side, little lines on one side and the other. And I'm saying lines, but you could shade with any marks, curvy marks or curly marks, or even little shapes, just so we build up some density of marks with particular attention to one side of it or another. Choosing sides here. It's okay. It's okay to choose sides on this. We'll all be friends still. Okay, now we want to draw a little bit we want to draw a center. Remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about centers, but if you weren't here or you don't remember, center can be that shape you just drew. That can be the center that you start with. The center is sort of what it sounds like. It's just a center of focus. So if you want to draw a closed shape here, you can. If you just want to draw some marks that are clustered around the center, that's also good. I'm going to draw this. Oh, that's just a little diamond shape. That's my center. Simple center. But choose a shape, see what comes out. This in no way excludes improvisation. You can be completely improvisational with the shape. Feel nothing. There's no really way to get it wrong. Okay, and around the center, now we want to draw another shape. It doesn't even have to echo the shape, but we want to put a boundary around the shape. We want to draw, if that shape was a little building, we want to fence in the yard around it. So leave some space for the yard and draw that little fence around it. And consider the shape that's forming in between the boundary and the center. And consider the path of the boundary, the shape of the boundary as well. I'll do one. These are quick. You don't have to spend a lot of time. And if you do one and you don't quite feel it, do another one real quick. It's okay. They don't have to be symmetrical. They don't have to be even. They don't really. The idea is that I did one there. There's my center that I drew, and there's sort of a boundary around it. Let me see, Lauren. It's too light for me. Oh, hang on. Show it again. I'm going to pin it so I can see it better. Do you want to put it up again? Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so it's a sort of a box around a diamond. That's good. That works. Okay. Yeah. So we're practicing quickly creating a center, and then we're practicing creating a boundary around that center, paying attention to the space between the center and the boundary, the shape of the boundary, and then also go now and do some shading like we just practiced and decide how you're going to shade that boundary. You're going to shade it in the inside in the yard, or you're going to shade it in the outside. Okay, let me see. I'm going to pin it, Dan. Hold on. Okay. Oh, yeah, look at that. Got figures. Oh, I see there's a center in the upper right, too, with a box around it. Yeah, good. Yeah, I like them both. I like the shading of the figure. It's smart. Okay, yeah, so now we're going to shade along the edge of that boundary and see what happens. See how it changes how that space in between looks when you shade it. Okay, yeah, so keep practicing on that. If you get one that you like, you might want to start another one, or you can continue to enhance that however you like, or maybe if you made a small one, make a big one. And work at a speed that's comfortable with you. And try to let that go. And again, your attention will be on the point of the pencil, watching whatever you're drawing emerge, even if you have a plan or if you're improvising, you're watching whatever comes out. And in the meantime, your peripheral awareness, is hearing the sound of my voice. And I'm going to be meandering through some ideas about boundaries, which is the subject. Boundaries in the volume 1 of the Nature of Order is the fundamental property number 3 of the 15 fundamental properties. Last week we talked about levels of scale, which he lists as the first one. I don't think there's really a hierarchy or an order, but he does put some of the more important ones, I think the bigger ones up front. So number 1 is levels of scale, which I think if you consider levels of scale in any kind of design, I've never seen a case where it doesn't apply and doesn't help to think about and doesn't improve a design to consider levels of scale. So for me, that one's definitely a number one. Number two is centers. And again, that's fundamental to the way he thinks about design. But we did a whole week on centers, so I didn't feel like it was time to go back and do another. And anyway, centers come up in all the properties anyway. So, and it's interesting that centers is a building block. So it occupies some large place in the hierarchy just below wholeness, but it's also a fundamental property. And the definition of centers is a recursive definition, as we talked last week. So even in his own structure, centers are recursive. Number three is boundaries, which is sometimes it's interesting and when I first heard about it and read about it, I didn't think, I thought boundaries, I really thought that was like outlines, but you'll see boundaries are more complex. And boundaries are really how centers connect to centers, which is kind of the exercise going on now. It also, boundaries are a way of creating more centers because that space that emerges between a boundary and the center itself becomes a center. So I'm going to show you some pictures. I started to look online and track down other people who talk about Christopher Alexander's work and the nature of order and write about it. And there's a number of blogs and people who have done it, and there've been classes here and there. And it seems to be a thing amongst aficionados of this work to collect good examples, because when you read the books, they're filled with really good examples, and you see an example of centers or boundaries or levels of scale, and you think, oh yeah, I get it. Oh yeah, I see that. And then you go online through Pinterest or Google Images or wherever you could look for pictures, and it's really hard to find really good ones. It's very funny that the examples he got are really good. So I'll show you a lot of his, but I decided also to take on the task of trying to find what I thought was a really good example. And if you want to find examples, that's also something that would be great to post. We could put up things that we find that fit these categories and try to make a good collection of them. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay. There we go. This is the picture I used on the little announcement that I put online today. This is an image from the lobby of the Hotel Tassel in Brussels. It's a building designed by the architect Victor Horta, built in 1892. And it's considered in the Wikipedia entry for this building, they say it's considered the first true piece of Art Nouveau architecture. And I love that they say it's the first true piece. That harkens back to wholeness. Like there was something about this movement and the people that embodied this art movement, as a lot of times when something new comes along and people see it for the first time, they really have a feeling for it. It's not in any way derivative. They really have an idea. It's really coming from someplace deeper. And that's that wholeness that Christopher Alexander talks about. And this really, for me, embodies many, many of the fundamental properties. But I like it as an example of boundaries. I like it as an example of boundaries because, for one thing, a staircase itself is a kind of boundary between floors. Like that's the place where you go. It's a place in itself, but it's also the place in between. So conceptually, the architectural object is a boundary. And then there's this wooden part on the outside of the stairs that sort of curves up and curls around, this beautiful piece of wood with these two lines of trim on it, a beautiful boundary. And then the railing, of course, forms the boundary, top to bottom, railing to stair. And then between the stair and the void there in the middle, it's also a boundary in that direction. And then over here on the wall is echoed these 3 or 4, well, it's like 3 greenish lines of trim. And then this like thicker baseboard, creating a huge thick boundary between the stair and the wall, very clearly outlining the curvature, demarcating the edge, probably also serving as a rail on that side. It's hard to tell if you could grip that, but it's possible. And then, of course, each stair itself has a thick part and a thin part and a thick part and a thin part of the step themselves, boundaries between all the steps. So lots and lots of good levels of scale of boundaries going on here. And sort of beautiful way of transitioning between the lobby and the upper floors. It's its own space. It's its own center. At the same time, it serves as a transition. So I was happy to find that. So that area, Christopher Alexander would call a living center. That's right there at the edge of wholeness, right there at the edge of something living. And he says that living centers are often, very nearly always, formed and strengthened by boundaries. So hopefully you'll see, if you draw a center in this exercise, you quickly draw a diamond shape or a center shape, and then you take some time to put the boundary around it, it's almost always going to form and strengthen that center. It's gonna give life to that center, that boundary around it. And you think about it, like nothing is really in isolation. Nothing lives separate. We're all connected in some way. We're all in relationship to every other object around us. So these boundaries are everywhere. I'll show you. This is from his book. Let me get back here. There we go. This is the one of the great examples in his book. It's a storehouse in Norway. You just look at it and say, well, it's an old building, whatever, not this elegant thing, and yet it just has this life to it. Something really, really warm and inviting about it, something very whole about it. It just seems to fit in its situation and its environment very well. It seems to be built like forever. It'll last forever. And you can see the borders around the doorway form this doorway as a center. They bound it left and right. And then on the second floor, there's an echoing of those with the columns. And it gives way to those 3 centers, like windows across the top. But also those columns are echoed on the edges, left and right. And they form centers of the whole face of the building. So lots of centers, and also all the little details on the columns form centers. So he says the purpose of a boundary which surrounds a center is twofold. First, it focuses attention on the center and thus helps to produce the center. It does this by forming the field of force which creates and intensifies the center which is bounded. So see if you feel that. See if you feel like when you draw a shape, draw a quick shape, and what's the feeling for that shape in that sort of whole open page, and then you create something around it. Like, what is the difference there in that shape? Is it sort of creates a tension for me, creates a tension between the shape and the other shape, creates that whole space in between. This is what the boundary is doing. It's kind of intensifying that shape. And then if you continue to add shapes, so if you want to make a center and put a boundary around it, and then put a boundary around that, and then put a boundary around that, what you're really doing is you're making a center, and when you put a boundary around it, you're strengthening that center. But if you put a boundary around that, you're making a center out of the first center and boundary. And then if you put a center around that, everything inside continues to be created as a center. So you're creating all levels of centers in there. So That's fun to try. If you want to expand the exercise a little bit, you can try multiple boundaries and creating multiple centers that way. Okay, the second purpose is that the boundary unites the center, which is being bound, with the world beyond the boundary. For this to happen, the boundary must at the same time be distinct from the center being bounded, must keep the center distinct and separate from the world beyond it, and yet also have the capacity of uniting that center with the world beyond the boundary. So in both ways, the center that is bounded becomes more intense. So it when you draw it out, it isolates the object from the boundary, but it also gives it a place on the whole page.
John, do you
Calls attention. Yes.
Sorry, John, have the quote for that? Can I read it?
I don't have it written down here. I'm just reading it off my notes. But I will make it available to you if you like.
Yes, that'll be great.
Let me see if I could do it quickly. I don't know if I have it. Yeah, I have a number of quotes. I'll just say, let me just say, put the quotes up when I'm done, if that's okay.
Yeah, could you read that quote one more time? It's just below.
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty long. All right. Wait, let me just see if I can hop. And it's not going to let me. Oh, yeah. Hold on. I might be able to do it really quickly. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop the sharing for a second, and I'm going to go to the chat. And I'm going to paste it in the chat. Okay. So it should be in your chat box. Yeah, good. Okay. The hands are clapping. I like that. Okay. Yeah, so again, when we shade toward the inside, we're intensifying that space in between and we're making the center more distinct. And when we shade to the outside, we're connecting it to the outside world. And the good boundary will do both things well. Okay, so now is another great boundary. This is a really worth studying one, really amazing one. And it shows you that the width of the boundary, like we think about a fence around something, we put a fence around our yard and it's very thin. It creates a kind of a thin boundary. And there's something that's not that whole about it. I mean, maybe the fence is like made of nice material, but there's something that I don't know. It doesn't give as alive a feeling as we have one part of our yard where it has a stone wall, and the stone wall is thicker, even though it's shorter and it doesn't really keep deer out or anything. It as something to look at. It's much nicer to live with, and it has something to do, according to Chris Alexander, with the thickness, the relative size of the center and the boundary. So I've had you draw a line around your centers, but so now as you're going, you should experiment a little bit when you make a center with the thickness of that boundary. So instead of making a line, maybe you're gonna turn your pencil to the side and make it thicker. Start to see how varying the thickness of the boundary changes the relationship. It's almost like automatically shading it. So here's the River Seine in Paris. And let's look at the boundary here. It's kind of this slopes up beautifully. like this slope could be, it could be a pile of rocks, it could be a muddy bank, etc. But they've sort of sculpted the slope, and the way the slope turns over into this kind of flat plane, which has its own thickness of stone, and then it turns into this brick walkway. And in some ways, visually, the width of the walkway, we know it's not as big as the river, but when we stand in a place and we look out, because of the way perspective works, it kind of looks like the width of the river, especially if you were to measure it on the picture plane. So there's a very great similarity with the thickness of the boundary and the thickness of the river. And then you have this other boundary. So this stones that line the brick walkway are boundaries of the brick walkway, making it a center, but the whole thing is a boundary. And then the whole thing becomes a center because it's between the river and the tree line. So that something can be both boundary and center. And this so beautifully connects the river up this slope to this park, these trees over here. This boundary beautifully connects the two while making the river quite distinct and, you know, giving this area so that you see the river starting, it's sloping down. It doesn't just drop off, it's going to slopes down. So be careful over here. This is something different. So it gives a great distinction between the river and the shore. But at the same time, it brings it along so very smoothly and gives a great transition over to the trees. So try to find some pictures like that. It's hard. Beautifully illustrated. So,
The slope is kind of a gradient of like make the condition smoother, but also maybe like just the practicality wise, it's easier to build like that, isn't it?
yes, yes, it's true. But I guess what I'm saying is you could practically you have to build something, but I think the choice here was done, you know, more aware of the design and more aware of the look than it could, because it could have just been a straight down wall, for instance, I think. I think on the other side, if you look at it, it does just go straight down. I don't think they have the embankment there. Go over here, I think it goes straight down.
Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah.
And yeah, you don't find examples of the wholeness in a place that frequently, I think, especially in the man-made environment. So when it works, it's worth it to watch it. It's worth it to look at it and sort of see how it is. Okay, so there's one other exercise before I'm going to go into some more slides. I'm going to give you one more exercise. Okay, and it's a similar exercise, but I just want you to draw another line segment, you know, a few inches long, not huge, small line segment. And if you're having fun and doing the other exercise or any of the exercises I give, again, or if you have your own practice that you want to continue, it's all perfectly fine. The whole idea is that you're going to do, if you just did drawing practice and had this as background noise, I'm perfectly happy with that. And I think that's great because drawing practice is where it's at. If you're drawing for this hour, it's wonderful. If you're able to draw daily, it's also wonderful. Yeah, it's all about enabling practice. So feel free to practice. But anyway, so you have a few inches long line, and then from the top of the line, let's say going left, you want to make a line which kind of goes all the way around to the bottom, going making a shape in one direction and then making a shape in the other direction. So you're creating two shapes which are bound by that line there. Okay. And then the exercise is to elaborate that line. In other words, elaborate that boundary, working with the two shapes. So shading is fine, or you can thicken that boundary or however you want. So that line will serve as a boundary. And if you want to add more shapes around your shapes and continue to consider the boundaries between them, that's also really good. Just so if you want another little thing to practice. Maybe we'll get to look at some. Okay, so let's look at some more boundaries, boundary conditions. I found some really good stuff. Sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, here is the Cathedral Door. And this, more or less, this big, well, there are lots of centers. The doors are centers, the bigger area centered. This one archway echoed and a bigger archway creates more and more. But this, it's more or less the boundary from, well, this is boundary from the door to the wall, which is this whole area, this with all this grill work, which is at least it's pretty thick. This area between the door and the wall is pretty thick. The area between the doors are pretty thick. These big areas may actually open as doors themselves. Okay, and then these archways, which are all nested and echoed at the bottom at a different level of scale, they're all nested, are really the boundary between the doorway and the rest of the building. So they frame and enhance this rectangular door, so you cannot stop directing your eye down toward the door. It really just brings your eye in right to the door. But at the same time, it easily transitions up all the arches and over into the facade. It also makes this beautiful transition. So the boundary itself, again, becomes a center, but it also serves as the transition between the two. I got another one. Okay, so here is text, Islamic text. It's sort of illuminated text. And the text here in the center forms a center, and then there's this beautiful gold boundary, and then sort of framing elements around it. There's a center at the top. You can imagine this here, center at the bottom. He says, taken by itself, the boundary rule seems simple, but the rule does not merely refer to the outer boundary of the thing. If we apply the rule repeatedly, or we could say recursively, if we apply the rule at all scales, it says that every part at every level has a boundary, which is a thing in its own right. This includes the boundaries themselves. They too have boundaries, each of which is a thing in its own right. What seems like one rule then is a pervasive structural feature of enormous depth, which in effect applied dozens or hundreds of times at different scales throughout the thing. So you can see like everything has a border, and everything that closes it creates space in between, which is itself a boundary, and then it's bound. So it's a really interesting way of looking at the designs. To think about when you're going to say, I'm going to draw a bottle, I'm going to draw a bell, I'm going to draw a car. And then think about that contour that you're making when you do that. And the idea is to make it resemble the thing you're drawing, but also think about it as the boundary between the air in the bottle and the air outside the bottle. It becomes this thing in itself. That in fact the contour has its own quality as a center and as a boundary. Okay. Well, we looked at this building. I think I had a picture of this building when I introduce all the principles, but it comes up a lot. It's a really good example of a lot of things, levels of scale and repetition, a lot of properties here. But yeah, this fits this idea that the boundaries have boundaries which create boundaries, on and on and on. This was one that was found by one of the people online. This is how I got the idea to find my own. And he was very proud of having found this one, these sort of interlocked bounds, which we do get into later in the principle, is the interlocking. So is this line the boundary of this shape, or it's part of the boundary of this shape, it's part of the boundary of this shape? It itself has shapes inside, and at a different level of scale, its edges are boundaries. So beautiful example of levels of scale. And I'll put all these pictures with the last note when I put the video up. So if you want to come back and look at them and zoom in on them, you can. This is a really great example of how what you might call a boundary becomes interlocked with other boundaries.
And John, like there are so many different boundaries in this picture, like and it, to me, like there is this interlocking boundary almost that it has its own life and beauty, and then there is an outer boundary which is almost at the edge of this rectangle.
Right.
Yeah, like they look like kind of like dead boundary, like
Yeah.
lively. It's less the focus that wanting to draw your attention. Yeah,
Yeah.
like
That outer edge is kind of wild, right? It's
yeah. And then there's like the line that just next to where you're pointing.
Right.
That line is very distinguished, almost like separate these two worlds.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I love that. That really shows like this blue line is really focusing your attention on the gold part, but it's transitioning it. It's almost like a wall against this kind of chaotic pattern outside, right?
Yeah, I think I just really like how clever this artist did. Like the inner boundaries is really like feel like part of the picture, almost like center.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Well, he says in his remarks, I'll say wait a second. He says, this additional example came up in my searching. I keep staring at it and getting lost in it, almost transported into a dreamlike state. So it can get that way. When you start copying these carpet patterns and these intricate design patterns, it can get complicated. And then you think about you're making simple designs in some drawing. You're just trying to work out the bark of a tree or the edges of a bottle or something, and think about how to incorporate these ideas. Think about the boundary.
This one of the Sufi carpet.
This is a manuscript. It's like the one I showed before. It's like that one, but slightly different. But it's a book like that. It comes from a book like that. I think it may be a front plate or a cover of a book. Okay, now we jump back to 1929, and Paul Klee, who almost always has something to say. He did a lot of studies about this kind of shading and about how the edges and boundaries change the character of the line, and he worked with it in a lot of his paintings. So, and if you remember every icon and all the sets of possibilities, this is one of the things that Paul Klee was really good at and sort of pushed me on the path of. So here he's showing two circles overlapping, shaded outside. So it's shading on the outside. If you remember my hatching tool, I always show it can shade on the outside, can shade on the inside. And look at the difference in the area of the crossover that it makes. And here you have one shape, and here you have a different shading. Here it's shaded on the outside, except on the inside in that crossover shape, like the Venn diagram crossover. And here it's shaded to the left. Yeah, it's all shaded to the left. And so you get a different look. And of course, he could do it shaded to the right and shaded up and shaded down. And then you can have left and up. And anyway, it starts to get quite complicated. possibilities. But really, from two circles, if you're going to draw two circles, there, you know, there's two circles and then there's two circles, and depending on how you arrange the thickness. And of course, you don't have to do all the little hatch marks. He's using that as an example, but even just the change in the thickness of your pen or your pencil, or if you're using the point on one part of the circle and the edge on the other part of the circle, as you change it, just changing the thickening changes that shading as you go. And so all this possibility exists for the circle boundary. And here's it gets a little more complicated, and he starts to number the patterns, and maybe you remember the divisible and individual structures. So he's using his numbers there to show. He's got the hatching there, and then he just changes the hatching slightly a bit here with some more concentric circles. Noticing, the effect, noticing the wholeness that is created by changing that. And when you work, thinking about like not just thinking about shading in one way or the other, but thinking really about that transition, about what you want to say and how you want that to move. Okay, this one. So here's an example of where there's a lot of Paul Klee drawings where he kind of scribbles, looks like. The scribbling is fine. He kind of scribbles and then kind of fills in, and then puts an eye here and there's a face. Sometimes you do that in a scribble. I think it's a very childlike exercise, but really fun and kind of revealing sometimes. So somehow he's drawn this out, and I don't know if he intended to make a figure, but maybe he saw a figure, but then he's used all this kind of shading in corners, and he's made these boundaries, or he's worked with these very hard lines, which are hard boundaries, to kind of change the nature of the shapes inside. And you got a lot of liveliness and a lot of movement. And here, where you get natural movement down in the lower left of the scaling, you get this natural size gradient. He doesn't do as much, but he enhances that. He puts it on the outside. But in the inside, where there's not a natural gradient, he tries to create the liveliness by putting the shading in all different areas. A really interesting way of bringing this to life. You might not think about to work that way. I think this is from 1922. It's in color. I only had a black and white image in his notebooks to show you.
What's his artist name?
Oh, this is Paul Klee.
Okay.
Klee, the Bauhaus artist. He's a Swiss citizen, taught in Germany in 1920s. This is another Paul Klee that I found. You know, I look at his notebooks. I know his work quite a bit. And here's this kind of scribbly line. He's kind of improvising with these right angles and squares. And look at the boundary that's created. There's also color, although not the color version. But here's dark to light, and here's this. It's almost like a city on a horizon or something like that. He's created this. The whole picture is really centered around this boundary, because it's really a color field and a color field, this circular shape, and it's really about how the picture plane is divided by this kind of scribbly line. So the boundary is the subject. Got another one. Here's another one where the picture plane is divided by this boundary. The boundary is the picture, but of course inside each of these sort of towers, there's more tiny boundaries, each one decorative. It's boundaries inside boundaries inside boundaries, or boundaries stacked up, and the whole thing divides the picture plane. So the whole structure of the picture is about this boundary in between the two. And then you have this kind of beautiful negative shapes in here that echo the shapes, the bigger shapes. So you have these white spaces underneath and the white spaces above against the edge of the paper that create shapes. So the boundary which divides it is itself bounded by white, bounded by these shapes. It really fits in the page quite well. A lot of wholeness in this one. Ah, and this one, I found another Paul Klee drawing. I think it's from 1908. It's an early one. I was surprised today because I saw it for the first time. It's called Carpet. So I was really excited because of the stuff we talked about, Christopher Alexander and the carpets. And I don't know if he was looking at a carpet, but goodness, there's lots of centers and lots of boundaries to be seen. And all is kind of, he's very inventive about pattern, all kinds of patterns. And of course, each one of those is a boundary between two, and then some lines, which are a boundary, and then another boundary, and some lines, which are a boundary, and another one. So again, I'll put this up. Okay, we're back to the staircase there. So that's. So it's interesting, I think, to see the properties, the fundamental properties, and then to sort of take them apart a little bit and play with them and sort of call attention to them as we're working and see how you know, we could imagine thinking about boundaries more. I think I could in my drawing. I I tend to want to make a shape and make that the thing and make that the subject and the positive space, and yet the movement between that shape and the outside is really, there's really a lot there. I think boundaries are really important. Of course, he was working in architecture and thinking about all these transitional spaces, not just the shape of the doorway, but what it felt like to move from outside to inside a building, or move from room to room, or to look from room to room. Even all the shapes of those boundaries, the shapes of the internal divisions of the space, is considering that. So it works also in 3D. Yeah, so I left a little time if there's questions or your thoughts about it and discussion. Oh, good. We'll see what Pat's got. Oh, you found the picture? I'm going to pin that so I can see it. That's the colors of it. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So he's got very contrasty reds and greens. And then there's really beautiful mid-tones in the boundary part. And then he's made just a gradient boundary at the top of the color. Yeah, so there's a lot to see in that. I think that's a really good example of boundaries, I think. It really, that picture's all about that.
Can you show me again? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh yeah, can you hold up again? I'm sorry I didn't track down the color picture today. I'm glad you found it. Wait, you're muted. You're muted, Pat. I can't hear you.
That's so wonderful. Thank you.
The boundaries idea reminds me of how attracted children are to make the God's eyes with the yarn in the center and all the boundaries of color.
But right along this very, very bottom, there's a boundary right there.
Oh yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, other thoughts or questions or things to share? We got something from Lauren. Let me look. Oh yeah, you got a page full.
Where are we? Oh.
Hold it up again, Lauren. Sorry. There we go.
Nice, yeah.
There is a kind of serpentine form that itself is a boundary between all the things you drew. Plus, I'm looking at the shapes, and that it turns back on itself and it cuts off, and then there's something inside the shape that it creates. Yeah, I like all that.
Nice.
Yeah, beautiful. You want to show one, Pat?
Yeah, I'll show. First, I have to unpin Lauren.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well,
You can just show
all
it.
right, there we
Yeah,
go.
okay.
All right, I just wanted to see what I'm doing.
Oh, yeah.
I
Look.
didn't understand about these two shapes that you said, draw a line and then put two shapes on either side of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I hold it this way, it has some interest to it.
Yeah. The boundary's very distinct there, I would say. The idea
Yeah.
was to play with the boundary between, but of course a distinct boundary is fine. How they
Okay.
edit the boundary is fine. I think that's good.
Yeah.
It does on the I guess at this point on the left side, on the one where it's darker, more shaded. No, in that one that we're talking about.
Oh, yeah, here.
Yeah,
This
there.
side.
Yeah,
This
I think if you made that shaded area like as dark as the line that divides,
Yeah, that's right.
it would get some more movement that way, and
Right.
that might make it
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Okay.
more interesting. Yeah, I like those divisions. Yeah, thank you, Pat. That was cool. Oh, Sharon. Okay, good. All right. Yeah. So you got boundaries inside of boundaries. You got some more. You're working with color, which is cool.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That, especially
Very
the middle
nice.
shape. Yeah, the
Oh,
middle shape
yeah.
is working well there.
Good.
Again, really thinking about the strength of the line, like how distinct that, because when I draw it, if you look at like my daily drawings for years and years, it was really about making a shape and coloring in the shape. And when I got more, when I got less, when I pressed less hard with the pencil, when I made that initial sketch line lighter, and I started to let that broaden into the things that surrounded it, the things started to flow a little more with that. So yeah, thinking about how distinct, like if you think in film terms, like there's a jump cut. So that's when you're in one scene and then boom, you're in another scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fine transition, and it has its place. But then there's also like dissolves and fades, and there's all kinds of clever things where a door is swinging and a new scene comes in along the door. Think about all the ways that you can transition in time in a film. You can think about how you transition in your drawing, how you're transitioning from one shape to another, one area to another. That's the boundary idea. We're putting a little more attention there and seeing how that property opens up. I found it opened up my drawing quite a bit, really, because my initial drawing efforts early on were very heavy outlines, and an advance in that drawing was to just let up and let those be shapes.
John, when you were showing the Paul Klee, it reminded me of Gaudi architecture too.
Yeah,
Well,
that's true.
The one of the banister was very much, I thought that was the Gaudi building.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan, you're muted.
That's my drawing.
Okay, cool. Yeah. You
Nice.
broadened it to the whole page, which is nice. And then the centers are surrounding. That's cool. And then there's the shapes in between. There's a very distinct kind of star-like centers, and then there's the shape in between that and the figures, I think.
Yeah.
Really
Nice.
take a look at that.
Uh-huh. Good.
Awesome.
Good.
Cool. Well, I'll hang out for a little while. If there are more questions or draw, I won't make it an hour, but I'll be around for a little bit. If people want to do drawing and chatting, and otherwise, I very much appreciate everybody for being here.
Thank you, John. I have to go.
Okay. I really enjoy
Thank you
it,
so
and
much.
we shall continue. Thank you.
I have to go
Okay.
to school.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye.